We're going to move on to our next and final speaker of the morning. It's Gema Zamarro. She's a professor and 21st Century Endowed Chair in Teacher Quality at the Department of Education Reform at the University of Arkansas. She's also adjunct senior economist at the USC Dornsife Center for Economic and Social Research. Her research is on applied econometrics in the areas of education and labor economics. Her current research focuses on the gender and education impacts of the current COVID-19 crisis, amongst other topics.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk about gender differences in couples' division of childcare, work, and mental health during this crisis. And this is joint work with Maria Prados. So as we all know, this crisis has greatly affected American households and households around the world, really. But it also has some distinct features that makes it possible to magnify gender differences in terms of childcare arrangements and work. Just to start, as Jill mentioned, it has hit really hard female-dominated sectors of the service industry, and we have seen more women than men losing their jobs. For those who remain employed, our work changed very much. Many of us have been forced to work from home. And at the same time, childcare needs really increase. Schools and daycare centers closed around the country in March, trying to contain the pandemic. And they continue to be really high, with a majority of families in the US are still doing some sort of remote learning with their children at home. So in our work, we are trying to understand gender differences within households during this of the impact of this COVID-19 crisis. We use data from the Understanding Coronavirus in American Tracking survey that Jill presented, so I'm not going to spend much time. So far, we have looked at 22 waves. I believe there are 23 waves available right now. I'm always trying to catch up. But we focus our analysis on working age respondents, 18 to 65, who report being married or living together with their partners in the same household, because we want to see this division of labor between couples. And what we do, we compare fathers and mothers, and when relevant, we also compare those without children and see how they are coping with childcare, employment, working arrangements, and psychological distress. First, I'm going to present results of the beginning, let's say the first part of the pandemic, using information from March to July, when schools were closed. All the schools across the country were closed. I'm going to present the results that we have there, but these results have been just published at the Review of Economics of the Household. So if you are interested, you can get much more details on the analysis there. So in the spring of 2020, we look first at childcare provision. And what we found is, not surprisingly, because this was the case already before the pandemic, but we see women are taking a much heavier load than men on the provision of childcare, and even when they are still working. So 1 out of 3 working mothers declare being the only one provided care and help with school when schools were closed in April to their children, as compared with 1 out of 10 working dads. So even though, as I said, this is not surprising because women were doing more of childcare even before the crisis, I find these differences still striking. And also we see that childcare arrangements in the spring were related with a reduction of working hours and less attachment in the labor market. So parents who reported being the only one providing care in the spring had a higher probability, 20 percentage points, of reducing working hours and a higher probability of transitioning out of employment. Then we also look at psychological distress with a measure that combines symptoms of anxiety and depression. So this graph shows the evolution of psychological distress in March until November, and it shows the percentage of those that declare at least mild symptoms of psychological distress. And we see a small but new gap appearing between women with children and those without children in April. So all groups were affected in April. There was a jump in psychological distress. Since then, this gap has been closed, and the levels have come down to those in March, but we still see a bigger gender gap in psychological distress among parents of school-age children than among men and women without children. And then our second analysis, and these are new results that we are working on, looks at the situation after the summer when schools in the country started reopening. So to study this, what we did was to merge the UES data with public information about the school reopenings at the census tract or county level. And in this graph, I show you the percentage of students whose public schools in a given county or are not are only offering online learning. So the blue indicates 100% online learning, and as you can see, there is wide variation across different parts of the country. So we revisit first the question about childcare provisions now in the fall when some schools are reopening. And what we see is that if anything, it seems that the situation for women is even worse, with more transitions into women becoming the only one providing care. So the proportion of working mothers who say they are the only one providing care to their children increased to 45% as of October, while it was 33% in the spring. And the proportion of working fathers remained almost the same. It was 10% in the spring, and in the fall is 9%. Moms also had a higher probability of remaining being the only one providing care, both in the spring and in the fall. They were 35 percentage points more likely to stay being the only one provider of care and school support. And we see similar patterns regardless of whether schools in the county of residence, whether they were fully remote or if they were offering some in-person learning. So then we want to see how in the fall, now that some schools are reopening, how this has affected transitions out of employment. Generally, as I mentioned before, we see that women have lost more jobs at a higher rate. They have lost jobs at a higher rate than men, and there are twice as many women that remain unemployed. So recovering from employment has been slower for women. Among those who were employed in March, 19% of women lost their employment back in April as compared with 15% of men. And of these, 17% of women remain without a job later in January as compared with 10% of men. But what we want to do is really to see whether the school situation mediates these effects in employment transitions that we are seeing. And to do that, what we use is a difference in differences approach. Basically, what this approach does is we are going to compare the probability of transitioning out of employment as well as the probability of staying out of employment after having lost your job early in the pandemic in April. And we did compare that among those parents who are employed in March before and after the summer, so before and after some school reopenings, and across counties where school reopened for some in-person education and those who remain fully remote. We also try a difference in differences approach where we add a second control, which is those individuals who have no children and they should not be affected by the school reopenings, and results were very similar. So I'm just presenting the difference in differences. So the first thing we see here is that, yes, women had a higher probability of leaving employment after March, even if they were employed in March. Having a college degree reduces the probability of leaving employment. Those areas whose schools only open remotely are also areas where people are faster to recover from employment lost. However, the speed of recovery from employment loss seems to be slower after the summer in those areas where schools didn't reopen for in-person learning and they were only remote. And finally, If the respondent was the only person in the household providing care for their children in a spleen, this is associated with a higher probability of leaving employment and a higher probability of remaining in without employment if they lost their job in April. So just to finish, I will say that overall, in all the work we have seen, we have documented important gender differences in childcare arrangements of school-age children, and moms are doing a much heavier load of this childcare than dads. And then we see that these childcare arrangements are associated with changes in working hours and lower levels of employment attachment. We see that the lack of school reopenings could make it harder to recover from employment lost early in the pandemic. And we also document this new small gap in psychological distress that emerged between mothers and women without children in the household in early April. And even though it has closed, it remains a larger gender gap in psychological distress among parents than among non-parents. So overall, as this crisis, we are 1 year in right now, so it continues over time. We think that these gender differences that we report are really important and they could have long-term implications and represent a step back in terms of gender equality. So we are going to continue, as long as the US continues recording this type of data, we are going to continue studying this situation. So thank you very much. If you are curious, this is my son, and this is how I had to do some of these online conferences when I had to help him with his school at home. Thank you.
Thank you, Gema. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna open it up to questions from the audience. And while we wait for that, I want to ask you how this compares to pre-pandemic times. What do you see as kind of the main messages or differences between then and now?
Yeah, so in the US, we don't have data on childcare before the pandemic, so we are not able to talk to that directly, but following other work from other countries, there is work from Spain and other countries, and what they have seen is that actually fathers, they started doing more, especially at the beginning of the pandemic in Spain during the lockdowns. But even though they were doing more, women were still doing more. So it's possible. I mean, there is a hope that, you know, with the situation, maybe that will create more equality on childcare. I think we have not seen that. We have seen both parents doing more, but still women doing much more than that.
Okay. We're still open for questions from the audience, but I do want to turn it a little bit to a question of policy now, because this is obviously really kind of striking circumstances, as we all know. And that's Wendy's question as well, actually, funnily enough. My question is, what is your thinking on what can be done to support parents and especially mothers, I think, in with childcare in these circumstances?
Well, I think this might be controversial, but I think what will help a lot is school reopenings safely. So I think a focus on schools do a lot, and this is only the effect on parents. Obviously, there is also a consequence of having kids outside the schools. I think there's been a lack of focus on schools, and there's been areas that have reopened, but that doesn't mean they have been focused on school. They just reopen everything. Right. So I think an example is European countries where schools have been the last to close and the first to reopen. And I think there have been less interruptions there. Second, I hope that with this work, we also mentalize employers and everybody about the situation that we are living during this pandemic. And I think there is now, or I perceive there is a better understanding of the challenges that working parents have. And another issue that is important is about childcare. So a lot of childcare, so a focus of policy on helping childcare centers. A lot of childcares saw it impossible and have been closing. So even in areas where maybe they could have reopened, now they have to get licensed again, get a place again for renting and restart all these businesses. So I think, I'm hopeful that the new administration has declared some interest and some focus on that type of policy.
I have a question from Peter, or comment, I guess, to you. We do not have data on children. However, we have compared 16 to 20-year-old adolescents in 2020 with adolescents in 2016 and 2012. In another paper that is in review now, we found some more problems in 2020 compared to 2012 and 2016, he says.
I have not seen much. I have seen a little bit coming out from the US. I think there are reported more incidents in terms of medical attending like ER or getting medical assistance of teenagers for mental problems. I have seen that data from the US. And just some reports in the news about cases.
There's a final comment from Matthias. He says, just speaking personally, I have done the majority of homeschooling for my kids. It had a large effect, and it's strange to hear that men didn't do much on average. Maybe the exception confirms the rule.
Well, I should thank Bart, who is my husband. And I think we managed to have some balance, but I'm not sure why, but yes, I think, women were doing more before. Women are still doing more of it. And I think on average that shows.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Gema and Peter and Wendy, for your presentations today. I think we have come up to our break time. I'm gonna let Tara tell us what to do next.